Hello and welcome to this final video of our quantitative data analysis series. I'd like to try to pull everything together in this final segment and show you what everything we've been doing actually looks like as a final artifact. So what does it look like as a research report or as a thesis? I'll assume that in your thesis or your research report, you're going to be working off the standard 5-chapter model, whereby we have a introduction chapter, literature review, methodology, findings and discussion, and conclusion chapter. The findings and discussion, naturally, there is always a choice as to whether you are going to combine the two together, deliver your findings and discuss them immediately, or deliver all of your findings in one chapter and then create a separate chapter for your discussion. So what is different in terms of that structure when you're doing a quantitative study as opposed to a qualitative study? So I think the best way to do this is to actually show you a research report in the form of a research paper, which uses a quantitative methodology. If you're doing a long essay in your second year, as is the structure in our department, you'll be producing something very similar to this, to a published paper. You'll be writing approximately 5,000 words, and it would be structured basically in the way that we will see here in this paper. If you're doing a full thesis in your third year, then you're going to be going into a little bit more detail. You're going to be producing a document anywhere from 10,000 to 12,000 words. So you have the space to discuss more and go into more detail. The introduction and literature review. So in a quantitative study, there's no real difference here. You're going to look at what others have said, what previous studies have said, what other authors have discussed. You will see what studies are most relevant to your topic. You will review them, and within that review, you will identify gaps and questions that you would like to address with your own study. So I'd like to show you really how a literature review is concluded, and a good literature review will end with the research questions. Now here is where we start to get into the differences between a qualitative and a quantitative study. In a quantitative study, you can finish your literature review with a question, but you can also finish it with a research hypothesis if you like. The only difference being that a research hypothesis would be a statement or a prediction, basically something, it's a claim that you can test. So upon reading the literature, you now suspect that you will find this thing, you will find something to be the case, and you go off and you collect some evidence and you see whether the evidence either supports or challenges your research hypothesis. So think of it as a claim that you can test. A research question is a question, so it's something which is more exploratory in nature. We would normally have a research question with a qualitative study. In a quantitative study, we can have either or. So we can have a research question, just one or two, maybe three, or we could have a research hypothesis, or both. But the point is, at this stage, you want to keep the conclusion to your literature review and the resulting question, so the question or the hypothesis, emerges from the literature that you've read. So it emerges from what we already know, such that you are going to continue and fill some kind of gap and top up what we know in some small but yet novel and significant way. So in this example, you can see how a literature review is concluded. Literally, the wording itself says, given the dearth in published literature on parental attitudes towards homework and so on. So the conclusion of literature review basically takes the stance of, okay, since the literature says this, and this, what I would really like to know is this, and then you show us the question or the questions. The structure of the report is then such that you are going to tell us how you're going to answer that question. So the methodology chapter is you explaining how you're going to address and ultimately answer the research question that you've posed that has come out of the literature. So you would start the methods with your general approach. Now here, this is where naturally quantitative research is going to diverge from qualitative, because the philosophical position that you're going to take is slightly different. In a qualitative study, you would normally be discussing at this stage that you would be taking a interpretivist approach or perhaps a relativist approach. Here you're going to be talking about things like positivism, empiricism. These are approaches to research which really are focused on evidence that can be observed and agreed upon by multiple researchers. So the idea behind doing a quantitative study is such that if multiple researchers had to investigate the same question in the same place on roughly the same population, those researchers should come up with the same or almost the same results. There's always going to be measurement error, there's always going to be variation, but ultimately they will agree on most of what they have found. In a qualitative study, that's not necessarily the case. So if you were taking a philosophical position that was rooted in interpretivism or relativism, you would not really be aiming to establish agreement between multiple researchers. If multiple researchers went off and investigated the same question, it wouldn't be a bad thing. On the contrary, it would be a good thing if they all came back and said something different. That's actually what we want. We want to go deeper. We want to uncover something new. So that is a different approach. That is a different philosophy. So here at the methods chapter, as you open this chapter, if you're doing a quantitative study, make sure that you're establishing your philosophical position such that you are justified in using a quantitative approach, a quantitative analysis. Generally, the methods chapter would be structured according to a data collection and a data analysis section. So in the data collection section here, you would talk about things like your sampling strategy and your instrumentation. So the instrumentation is really important because that's where you say, okay, I used a questionnaire, or I used observations, or I used these field tests. You would explain exactly what you used, what tools you used to collect your data. Also, what's extremely important here is the setting up of your variable. So if you look at this example, here we show a table with the variables on the left. So general attitudes towards homework. This study was about attitudes towards homework. That was a variable that was measured using particular items in our questionnaire, in our scale. So this table in the data collection section actually sets up precisely what we're measuring and how we're measuring it. More specifically, it sets up and operationalizes the variables that we're going to be basing our study around. The variables ultimately that are going to help us to address our research question or our research hypothesis that we set up previously at the end of the literature review. I should also say here, if you can use previously validated scales and validated tools, all the better. So if you had to, for example, be measuring anxiety, you would use an established anxiety scale that you found in the literature that ideally has been used in other studies and ideally fairly recent studies. So you would use an instrument that is in use at the moment, at the time when you're doing your own study. That's another reason why it's so important to do a really good literature review, is to really find all the literature you possibly can surrounding your topic so that you can learn what sort of instruments are generally used so you can use the same. That makes your job a little bit easier when you come to write your data collection section, because the tools that you're using are established and you can include citations and you've got good justifications for why you're doing what you're doing. Now, the data analysis part, this is where you set up your hypotheses that you're actually going to test. These are the hypotheses that we were talking about in the previous videos. These are the hypotheses that you're actually going to set up a null for and then use inferential statistics to test that null. So the null hypothesis is the hypothesis that nothing's going on, and the statistics that you're going to come up with are going to help you to decide whether you can reject or fail to reject this null hypothesis, this idea that there is nothing going on, that there is no effect. So here in this example, you can see that this table sets up all of the more specific hypotheses that we're actually going to test using data and statistics, and it sets up also the null version of that hypothesis. So for every hypothesis, for instance, hypothesis number 1. So this is presented as capital H subscript 1. parental attitudes towards homework are generally positive. Now, these are items measured on a linear scale from 1 to 5, 5 being strongly agree and 1 being strongly disagree. So here, the actual null hypothesis is saying that the attitudes measured on a linear scale from 1 to 5 are less than 3. So they are not more than 3. We discussed this in the univariate hypothesis video. Now, you don't have to write the null here as it's presented as an equation. You can just state it in words, just like we've done here with the research by hypothesis. So we've said parental attitudes towards homework are generally positive. Here you could just present the null if you wanted to, and you could just say parental attitudes towards homework are not generally positive. And in the table as well, we include the sources from the literature that are backing up or led us to want to test that particular hypothesis. And we're also including the statistical procedure that we're going to use. Here we used, for instance, a simple confidence interval. This is not something that we've discussed in this series. We discussed the Wilcoxon test, which does the same job in terms of testing this kind of univariate hypothesis. So the table basically sets up all of the hypotheses. Here we have 14, it's quite a lot. You don't need to have this many. In fact, ideally you don't. Ideally you have less than this. But it does show you, it does illustrate the general structure. So what I really want to highlight here is if you're doing a quantitative study, you want to be very systematic about setting up in your data collection section, tell us what the variables are. Tell us what you're measuring and how you're measuring it exactly. If you can show us a table, something like this, all the better. Similarly, in the data analysis section, you would then take those variables, which you've just explained to us and you've set up clearly, and then enter them into a series of hypotheses. Now, remember, they can be univariate or multivariate. So here you simply add them in whatever combinations you want and tell us, set them up. H1 is this, H2 is this, and so on. And if you can also include the statistical procedure in the table, it's even clearer. In any case, at some point in this section, you want to tell us how you're going to test each of these hypotheses. Now, whether you do it in the table or in the text, it doesn't matter, so long as it's clear what hypotheses you're trying to test and how you're going to test them. And then we move on to the findings and discussion. So in this particular example, they are mixed together, but as always, as I said earlier, you have the choice to split them up if you want to. Now here, let's talk a little bit about the findings first. So we were discussing in the previous videos how you actually present the findings for each test that we went through. As you can see in this particular example, a lot of the test statistics are being presented in text. So we discussed for each particular test what you would put in brackets when reporting the results. Basically, you put whatever the output in JASP gives you. So if it gives you the test statistic, like the chi-square for example, now this is not an X, this is the Greek letter chi. So in your word processor, make sure that you insert special character and choose the Greek symbol for chi. It looks like an X, but the lines are a little bit curved. So here, that's the test statistic, the chi-square. So if it just gives you the test statistic and the p-value, great, just write that. If it gives you the test statistic, the effect size, and the p-value, write that. If it also gives you the degrees of freedom, then you also put in df equals whatever the case may be in those brackets as well. Now, this all depends on what JASP gives you. So you don't have to make the decision for yourself. Just make sure you report what JASP gives you in the output, provided you followed the instructions that we've gone through in these videos and you've chosen the test that you need to choose for the particular variable combinations. Now, apart from the statistics in text, you can also use visuals. So here is an example of using, here is a series of box plots, but you can use any of the visuals that we went through in the previous videos for each test. I showed you a corresponding visual, with the exception of the chi-square test of independence, when we have a multivariate hypothesis with two nominal variables. I did not show you a way of showing that visually because JASP doesn't actually give you that option within the contingency table test when you're setting up the chi-square test. So I can quickly show you a workaround here. If you do want to show a visual for a nominal on nominal hypothesis, a workaround is to use a logistic regression. So if you click on regression and choose logistic regression, so long as one of your variables only has two levels, you can use this workaround. So here in our sample data set, we have gender and course. Those are our nominal variables. So I'm putting gender, which has two levels, as the dependent variable, and I'm putting course as the factor. So this is a logistic regression. Now, the logic behind this test is similar to a two-way contingency table, but in this case, we have the option to show some more detailed statistics, and we also have the option to produce a plot. So if you click on plots and you choose conditional estimates plots. So when we say conditional probability, what we mean is we are predicting some outcome. If you look here on the left, we can see here that JASP is taking the male level or the male category as its predictor. So the probability of finding a male in each of these levels, so each of these courses. So the probability of finding a male in each course is represented by these dots. And as always, we have these confidence bars. They all overlap. So again, this is a nice visual way of showing whether or not there is a significant difference in that probability of finding either a male or a female in any of these courses. Now, while we're on the subject of which statistical test to choose for each particular hypothesis, I should mention that JASP has a great feature where you can gain additional information on whatever tests you're running, including citations. So here, for example, I've set up an independent samples t-test. We used this option to run the Mann-Whitney test. Let's say we want to get a bit of background on why we chose the Mann-Whitney test. If you click here on information, you get not only background information on how to interpret the test results, but also you get some background on the test itself, including some references. So these are very handy to use in your methods chapter to justify and back up why you're doing this particular test. So something you would write here would be, in the data analysis section, you would stipulate that you are using non-parametric approaches. And just like I said in the very first video, your justification here is that non-parametric procedures are a robust approach that do not require us to make any assumptions about the distribution of our data. So let's talk just a little bit about what the discussion part should consist of. So this is a good moment in your writing to go back to your literature review, look at the sources that you discussed there, and think about them from the perspective of the findings that you now have come up with. So you've done your analysis, you've put your findings there on the page. Now go off and read the literature and the other sources that discuss similar topics, similar issues, similar questions, and see how your findings relate to what those other researchers and authors have said. Do your findings support what they've said? Do they contradict what they've said? If so, how and why do you think this has happened? Basically discuss the similarities and differences of your findings with closely related literature and expand. Tell us what are the implications. What does this mean? Explain it to us. Once you've done this exercise where you've really looked at your findings, you've thought about them deeply, you've read the associated literature, you've made comparisons, you've tried to make the links. Once you've done all of that, you are going to end up with take-home points. And those are the basis of your conclusion. So at this stage, you should be bringing it all together and ultimately answering your original research question and addressing the main aims of the study, which you would have set out in the very beginning in the introduction chapter, which we haven't actually mentioned in too much detail here because there is really no difference in the way you would approach an introduction chapter if you're doing a quantitative as opposed to a qualitative study. So they're ultimately the same. So at this stage of the write-up, when you reach the conclusion, you would close the circle, answer your questions. If you can't answer them, then why not? What additional questions has it raised? Make sure to include recommendations for future research. Also include recommendations for practice. So given the take-home points and the insights that have emerged from your findings and discussion combined, so remember the findings are what they are, but you bring them to life when you do the discussion chapter. So by discussing and coming up with take-home points, you can now make some recommendations for real-world practice, for real-world application. So because you found what you found, what can we now do differently in your particular field? Finally, you want a limitation section in here as well. Now, I wouldn't actually do this last. I would do this first within your conclusion chapter to get it out of the way. So the limitations are, what are the boundaries in which we are supposed to interpret your finding? So don't think of the limitations so much as being hypercritical about your work and sort of defending all of your decisions that you made. Think of it more in terms of, these are the limitations within which I would like you, the reader, to interpret my findings. Remember, when you're thinking about my findings, please keep this in mind. I think that's a useful thing to keep in mind when you're constructing and really deciding what you can talk about in that limitations section. Now, just to tie up all the loose ends, I'd just like to talk very, very briefly about sample size. As a general rule, use as large a sample size as you can reasonably recruit. That perhaps goes without saying. The more the better, generally. However, you can be a little bit more systematic about establishing how many participants you need to have in your study to actually be able to make valid claims. Now, I'll just very quickly show you another feature in JASP. JASP gives us the power option here. So if you click on the plus on the side, tell it you want power in the toolbar, click power. This allows us to do some simple G-power calculations on what the sample size should be. So that brings us to the end of this research report. Now, what we've gone through here is enough definitely to get you going. Remember that in JASP you have many resources within the software itself to help you. So this information button is very useful, so make sure to use it. This can often answer many of the questions that you have. Remember, there is also a very good support structure surrounding JASP. So there's lots of YouTube videos, there's lots of material online for you to fall back on if you get into any trouble. So from my side, I think that's it. I hope this has been helpful. I hope that this has been encouraging. One of the messages I always like to emphasize is that there is nothing inherently difficult about doing a quantitative study as opposed to a qualitative study. On the contrary, at least in my opinion, I do believe that it's easier to do a good quantitative study than it is to do a good qualitative study. Now, this is a bit controversial, but in the social sciences, we sometimes refer to experimental designs in particular as the gold standard. Now, that involves a quantitative analysis, so that actually falls under what we've been doing here. If you're going to create a simple experiment, you will be using some of the procedures that we've discussed here. If you want to do a good, basic, but robust, well-designed, well-thought-out experiment, that is probably the best strategy at this level to get a top mark. So please do not discount or dismiss quantitative analysis on the assumption that it's difficult. Thank you very much. If you do need any additional help, you can contact me directly.